afternoon. We have, I think, an excellent speaker to take us forward in this part of the conference, Cronin. Cronin is an educator and researcher in the Centre for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at the National University of Ireland in Galway. Catherine's work focuses on openness and open education, network learning and digital identities. And the talk that she's going to give for us today is called Openness in Higher Education, Choosing Our Paths. So, colleagues and friends, please welcome Catherine Cronin.
Okay, is that on? Yes, find a place for it. Here we are. Thank you so much, everyone. Where's Catherine Johnson? Hello. Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me here today. And I was sitting there looking at who's sitting here in the room, thinking that I probably knew two people that I had physically met before I came today. And I feel like now I'm looking at all these lovely people who I've met and had conversations with today and also yesterday. So I really appreciate the invitation to be part of all this. Before I came, I was really struck by the prevalence of the student voice in the conference and in the outline Catherine gave me. And just based on my own experience, what I've seen today and the tweets, that very much seems to be the heart of what's happened here today. So I commend you for that, and we need more conferences that do that. As Tim said, I identify myself as an open educator, and I'm in a period of time now where I'm transitioning from being an open educator and practice only to someone who's researching that as well. So I suppose my voice today will be a bit of both of those, from myself as a practitioner and also as a researcher. And I hope that the ideas that I'm going to share just over the next little while will just be part of the conversation that we're having, because I really feel like a lot of the things I've been thinking about preparing for today have come up already at the conference, and hopefully we can continue it over cake afterwards. In choosing the title for the session, Catherine asked me to speak about openness in higher education, and the subtitle is really about choices, and that whole notion of agency has come up so often today. And the choices that I was thinking about were, we make many choices as educators, why and where and how to learn, how we teach, who we learn with, how much choice students have in the learning environments that we create and co-create with our students. But I also hope to talk about another level of agency, which is beyond our individual practice. How might we help direct the institutions that we work in to help them grapple with some of these questions around openness and network learning from our standpoints. So I'm very active on Twitter. My Twitter name is @CatherineCronin, and I'm connected to some of you already. And the hashtag TLFest15. I just tweeted the links to my slides. They're available on SlideShare, and I just tweeted a link if you want to grab them from Twitter. So openness in higher education. Two main questions drove me in thinking about today, and one was why? Because it's quite straightforward to come together and talk about the mechanics of openness, open licensing and all those kinds of things, but I really think that the important question is, why would we do this? We're all very busy, we're overburdened, we're teaching lots of students, and now people are coming along and saying, we need to be more open. Well, what is that, and why is that important? And also, how is it related to networked and connected learning? So the first part of the talk will just be talking about the broader context of higher education, kind of the social and cultural context, which informs that why. And then the second part is really maybe talking about what some of the challenges are for us as educators. And again, I hope to touch on some of these things that many of you have already mentioned today. I feel like I'm speaking to a room full of people who know a lot of these things already. So a starting point for me is the whole notion of networked individualism, and some of you may be familiar with this book by Lee Rainey and Barry Wellman, just a couple of years old, and they picked up Manuel Castell's notion of the networked individual. And Castell's identified some years ago, about 15 years ago, that the morphology of society is changing from the more hierarchical forms of society with one-to-many communication to more networked forms. of communication. So Rainey and Wellman talk about different information and communication ecologies, which we operate in as networked individuals. So they talk about social networks, not the social network. I probably should have put that in lowercase. But just the fact that over the last century, really, we've been operating more in terms of social networks, not only with the groups that, the in-touch groups of our families and our neighbors and so on, but we operate more as social networks. And then that's been amplified by social networking using the internet, which, certainly arose out of an ethic of openness and innovation, though we have to be guardians of that as the internet develops. And then the addition of mobile, which really completely changes our sense of space and time and presence. So all of these things have contributed to the fact that we really operate very much as networked individuals. And I can show so many examples of this. This is just one. I've used this one before from the Pew Research Center. Some of you may be familiar with these resources. This is social networking site usage by age group from 2005 to 2013. So we could look at many, many things. We could look at web development, app building, gamification, games, all kinds of things. So this is just one aspect of networked individualism, and that's the use of social networks. And you can see, the curves are by age. So while younger age groups might have been, that red curve, been more early adopters, the steepest curves are in the older age groups. So there may just be a time lag, but as a culture, we are social networking to a great degree at all ages. So we're really, we still must recognize that there's a digital divide, that not all people are represented by these curves, but that digital divide crosses all ages, but so does networked individualism cross all ages. So we'll bang on the head the idea of digital natives right now, and talk about the complexities of this. But if you think about yourself as a networked individual, when you want to find something out, what do? You have a question? You Google, yes. You search, and you may connect with other people in your network. Those of who are on Twitter, for example, we might use Twitter or other social networks like that to curate the web. By the way, these are also some of the things that we counsel students not to do, which is curious. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that is how we operate as networked individuals, and that's just an example. About 8 years ago, Alec Kouros came up with this diagram, which is widely used and modified by different people. But he was just trying to capture this notion of the networked teacher or the networked educator. And in the upper right-hand quadrant there, the labels on things aren't that important because these things change. But in the upper right-hand quadrant, we talked about the few things that we would have relied on 20 years ago, which were the people that you knew, published texts, your physical network. But now this has exploded. And we could put many, many things here now. And this is due to our ability to network openly with a huge amount of content and a huge, limitless number of people. So my question for you, just to consider, is think about what is your network? What is your network for learning, teaching, and perhaps research, if you're a researcher? And I might just say 1 to 2 minutes, just if you want to talk with the person next to you, just to really try and think about what is your network? How are you connected to find information and connect with people? Okay, how many people have Twitter in their network? Okay, quite a lot. And you're going to say something?
I just find it very difficult to answer because my life is like so many networks.
Yes.
It's difficult to decide where networking life.
It becomes invisible in many ways. Yes, that's a great point. And this is one of the tools that I use to kind of aggregate my online presence on the web to kind of show my network. So Alec, of course, talks about this as well. A lot of people give their university webpage as their kind of online presence or who they are, whereas I feel my presence online is in so many different places. So I use a tool called About Me. Some other people in the room use About Me. Yeah, there are many other things like this. So I'm active on Twitter, Instagram, Flickr, WordPress blog, Google+, lots of other things. SlideShare for conferences, Digo for bookmarks, that kind of thing. But this is a live page for those of you that don't use About Me. So anytime somebody accesses this page, it shows kind of the three most recent blog posts. And if you click on Twitter, you see my most recent tweets. So it's always evolving. But in putting this slide in here before the presentation, I was thinking what's interesting is that it's just what you were talking about. it's difficult to completely separate selves. There will be a lot of things in here about my research and my teaching. There will also be things about conferences I've gone to and maybe a few personal things, and there's a blend because it is really difficult to disentangle our different selves, not only our digital and our embodied selves, but the different aspects of ourselves, from work to private to other things that we might be involved in. And I'll touch on that again later. So the context of what I wanted to talk about in terms of changes in higher education and openness is this notion of participatory culture, which some of you might be familiar with, originally defined by Henry Jenkins. Mimi Ito has done a lot of work in this area as well. It was, the term came as kind of a counterposition to consumer culture. And it would have been closely allied with the term Web 2.0 a number of years ago. And it was this whole notion that we can all be creators, that we no longer have to rely on just a few people controlling media and controlling what gets published. We can all publish. And these 5 kind of characteristics of participatory culture, Henry Jenkins identifies it, and that is low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement. We have the tools on our phones, to video, share artwork, Facebook, whatever it might be. Strong support for creating and sharing. Social connection is immensely important, so people often create to share. Members believe that their contributions matter, and there's the notion of informal mentorship. So people help one another, learn new tools, try new things, comment, and so on. So, does anybody know what this photograph is? That's in Dublin. Yes, indeed.
That's fantastic.
So I always like to share a personal story, and this is so alive in me right now that I had to choose this, and it's also a fabulous example of participatory culture. So yes, you win the bottle of wine too, another bottle of wine. This is a gathering of people that were gathered in support of a yes vote for the marriage referendum, which was held in Dublin exactly 3 weeks ago today. And the referendum was held on the 22nd of May. It passed by a popular vote of 62% to 38%. So that same-sex couples could get married and have all the rights of marriage. And Ireland became the first country in the world to legislate for same-sex marriage as a result of a popular vote. So other countries obviously have legalized marriage equality, but that's been because of a judicial decision, for example, in the US, like in the Supreme Court, or through legislative change in other countries. So social media was a huge aspect of the campaign and everything that was going on up to it. And that marriage referendum hashtag was one of the primary hashtags that was used, and then there were several others as well. But activity built, if you were watching social media, activity built on the marriage hashtag in the months and then the weeks and then the days leading up to the referendum very much. There were 200,000 tweets in the last week, and about half of those were on the last day. So what kinds of things were people sharing? Early on, Irish citizens who lived outside Ireland who couldn't be there to vote mobilized and created these artifacts on the web. There were kind of short videos, photographs. These were Irish citizens in New York City, London, Perth, and Abu Dhabi. You can see that they kind of understand the power of the visual image, standing in front of important places that people would recognize. Sometimes they held up signs. These were media creations designed to be shared, and shared using hashtag and to get a reaction, and many of them were very powerful images. There were also public artwork. This was a mural painted by a young artist called Joe Castle in County Galway, very near where I live. And these pieces appeared around Ireland in different places. And these were wordless images, again, just in support of in the referendum. Another of Joe Castle's, he had 2 main pieces. This is the second one. First one was rural, and this one was on South Georgia Street, right in the center of Dublin. And this became iconic, this particular image. It was reproduced on the front page of the New York Times, and other artists remixed that artwork in other ways to produce new artwork. And again, all of these were shared using hashtags on social media. This whole kind of power of the visual. And there was also guerrilla artwork going on. It wasn't just artists that were doing this. Small spaces, shop windows, alleyways, blank walls, here, there, and everywhere. These images started, and murals started appearing, particularly around Dublin. And in the last few days before the vote, there was a new hashtag called Home to Vote. And did anybody see the Home to Vote hashtag activity? Okay, it was immensely powerful in particularly the days leading up to the referendum. There are a lot of Irish citizens who wanted to vote, and you cannot vote if you're outside the country. So for those who had been gone for less than 18 months, they could travel home to vote. So people who were doing that were tweeting and writing Facebook posts and doing things using this home to vote hashtag. And on the morning of the referendum, Annie West, an artist, published this illustration, which kind of powerfully captured that notion of people flying in from lots of different places. Una Lally, a young journalist, was one of many people who tweeted, this is where people were coming from everywhere, coming home to vote. They weren't all serious. There were different genres and tones of communication. Here's one that was widely shared on the web. You can see the favorites and retweets on that. And there were a few like that. And then the morning of the referendum, there were a few tweets like this. It was the 9:10 London to Holyhead train. There was a whole carriage that was all of these Irish citizens coming home to vote. But it wasn't all, image and color and social media. There were analytics that were done kind of around what was happening. So a different kind of view. And Ivor Crotty did this analysis and retweeted this several times during the day. So he looked over time. Here's a bigger image of it, of different hashtags. And this was about 2 p.m. in the afternoon on the vote. And it's an amazing illustration of where people were tweeting from using different hashtags, and it's really a snapshot of the Irish diaspora, interestingly. That huge concentration in Europe and then kind of the coast in the US and so on. It's a powerful and beautiful example, I think, of participatory culture, what I was just talking about, and the literacy practices of participatory culture that we use as networked individuals. So this communication was multimodal, multimedia, networked, the whole use of the hashtag, a number of different hashtags. So things were created and shared, designed to be shared. The social is immensely important. They were purposeful. There was a clear and urgent purpose to a lot of them. Many of them were collaborative. People remixed different things that were being shared, and they were agentic. Again, that notion of agency. So all of these things kind of define, agency. People felt they had a voice, they had a choice. They chose the topic and the content of what they created, the genre, the tone. Is it serious? Is it humorous? Is it ironic? Space and place became collapsed because of the whole notion of being networked, and people felt part of it in different spaces and places. And because, again, things were being shared over time and duration, that was very fluid also. So a question for us, if this is the context that we and our students are living in, is are we meeting students in spaces where we provide them the opportunity to do these kinds of things, this kind of communication, this kind of creation? Students are coming in with existing literacies, existing values, existing identities, maybe budding and emerging, maybe quite complex. Are we helping students to map those to what we do here in higher education? And I think that's a really big question, and that's where the urgency around openness and networking comes from, is that when we recognize that this is how people are learning and communicating, then it's an imperative for us in higher education to try and think about how we build bridges to do that to students of all ages, of course. So there are some individuals here who I know are doing this work, and I've been so impressed with what I've seen. But this is not generally visible in higher education across the board. This kind of meeting students and connecting formal and informal learning. And in many senses, students really experience a divide. So they use a particular set of practices and identities outside higher education, and then they walk into our institutions, they step over the threshold, and we say, leave those identities and those practices behind, come into Moodle or Blackboard or whatever it might be, and you're 447652, and here's all of the resources that you need for this course and so on. And oftentimes, not always, very little opportunity to move across that boundary. So many students experience a dissonance between, okay, there's this set of practices and identities that we use in higher education, and then I use all my other selves and practices outside. And we're really not teaching students or modeling how to bridge those. And that is real learning, is the amalgamation of the formal and informal. That's what we do. But are we modeling that and helping our students to learn that is a big question. I had to share, I know Donna Longfellow was here last year at this university, and She and Dave White worked together a lot on the visitor-resident project, which many of you are probably familiar with. I just really wanted to share one of their slides because I think it's really important. I don't want to be misunderstood to be saying that we're talking about digital natives, you know, that all young students have these practices. I just don't want to be misunderstood in saying that because that's really not the case. The Visitors and Residents Framework enables us to talk about this in all its complexity. So the Visitor and Residents Framework means that, you know, for all of us in different contexts, we might be visitors sometimes, which visitor practices are you just go to the web, you get something, you go off the web and you get what you need. You look something up. Whereas if you have more resident behavior, you have a presence, a social presence on the web, you are on the web, you know, and interacting in that way. And we can be visitor and residents in different ways. So maybe in Facebook I'm a resident and Twitter I'm a visitor. You know, so it's not straightforward. But the real question is, you know, are we helping students to transpose the practices that they've developed in different domains, you know, into the domain of higher education, to deepen those skills, to develop those skills, and to build identities? I think that's really the important question. And in work that Dave White and Donna and others have done in the Visitor Resident Project, they found that by and large we are not doing that. And this is, I know it's a long quote, but I really like this concept of the learning black market. Students feel that they have to be furtive about using, you know, Google and Wikipedia, because whether we're saying it explicitly or implicitly, they get the message that that's not scholarship. You know, that's not what you do. So I've used the metaphor of navigating the marvelous before, and some of you might be familiar with it. I just want to share it here briefly because I think it's one way of understanding that dissonance that our students experience. And the metaphor comes from a poem by Seamus Heaney called Lightnings, which some of you may know. It's a 1991 poem, and the definition of lightning is to make light or to illuminate. That's the definition that he uses, and it's based on an ancient Irish legend about monks in Clonmacnoise, not too far from where I live in Galway, who, the legend goes, were, you know, in their church and around their monastery, and they saw a ship sailing in the sky. So they're completely shocked. So this ship sailing in the sky above them, and the anchor gets caught down below, and the crewman climbs down to try and release the anchor, and the monks realize that the crewman can't breathe, so they release him and let him go. So I have a clip of Seamus Heaney, it's just about a minute long, reading the poem, so I'll play that.
The annals say, when the monks of Clonmacnoise were all at prayers inside the oratory, a ship appeared above them in the air. The anchor dragged along behind so deep it hooked itself into the altar rails. And then, as the big hull rocked to a standstill, a crewman shinned and grappled down the rope and struggled to release it, but in vain. This man can't bear our life here and will drown, the abbot said, unless we help him. So they did. The freed ship sailed, and the man climbed back out of the marvelous as he had known it.
Beautiful line, out of the marvelous. It's actually the title of one of Heaney's biographies. And it's just such a beautiful short poem, and I think it highlights the existence of two realities. And when we're in one reality, it's often difficult for us to conceive of another, because the reality we're in is just the water we swim in, the air we breathe. It's just normal, you know, just like all of us in higher education. Literally, the air we breathe. But to those from another space, it may seem out of this world or marvelous. And indeed, when they come from another space into this space, they may feel they cannot breathe. So I suggest that, you know, some of our students may have that feeling of not being able to breathe when they come into higher education spaces because they can't express themselves or they don't receive the affirmation of who they are, what they do, how they learn. And, you know, we can all probably relate to this. You know, you think yourself of, you know, have you ever been in a situation, an institution or an organization or whatever, where you felt you couldn't breathe? So that's the context, and I just have 3 contributions to the dialogue with that kind of as the background of this notion of openness. Robin Good talks about openness, digitality, and scholarship, an article that I referenced in the introduction to my talk that I sent to Catherine. And he talks about scholarship and sociality being intertwined, but they're in opposition to each other sometimes, and sometimes they're consonant with each other. It's that complex relationship between scholarship and sociality. So I want to look at that as a both-and relationship between scholarship and sociality. And the 3 contributions to the discussion are these. One, considering this whole notion of developing, modeling, and embedding digital literacies. There was a history project presented this morning. Is that person here? I missed that session, and I heard that it was a wonderful example of this, modeling digital literacies. The second is choosing open where possible and where appropriate. It's not always possible, and it's not always appropriate. Obviously, it depends on your students and yourself, and what you're learning together. And the third is connecting across boundaries, across those boundaries between informal and formal, and across many other boundaries as well. We've talked about a lot of those today around international students, disability, gender, and so on. And just overall, really, how do we model and nurture democratic practices within our institutions? So those are 3 points, and I'll just define kind of the ecosystem or landscape of practices in higher education, just because I think that's a good way to think about what we might do. And I conceive of 3 different spaces, and they kind of bleed into each other and so on, but for the purposes of argument, I'll present 3 different spaces that we could think about. Physical spaces, like the room we're in here together, bounded online spaces where you must be a member to join. So like a VLE would be an example of a bounded online space, although not the only one. And then open online spaces, where anybody can come and they're much more permeable. So I hate to get into a match around, pro-VLE and anti-VLE. That's not really the point of this. It's not really about choices between them, but it's about thinking in our own context about what happens in each of these spaces and what's possible in each of these spaces that might help us make choices around them. So physical spaces, for all their constraints, can be very safe spaces for learners. It can be a great place to develop community together among students and with teacher, group dialogue, collaboration, all getting around and facing one another. But there are also barriers, of course, like the room we're in today. All of us know the experience of trying to create community and being scheduled in a room like this one. Right now, this is part of a day of conversations and so on, but if you were teaching in this room all the time and trying to do that, collaboration, peer feedback and so on, it's awfully difficult. And as educators, we often find ourselves working against the architectures in the spaces that we teach in, and I often use the term with my students, the tyranny of the architecture. Sometimes it's good even just to acknowledge it with the students. Say, well, this is a really crummy room to do what we are trying to do, and what can we do? Because it's so powerful, these kinds of rooms. It's kind of one focal point of the room, whose voice is privileged, whose knowledge is privileged, all of that unspoken. You just walk in the room and that hits you. So that's coded in. It's possible to build community of learners in rooms like this, but it's challenging, as many of us know. In bounded online systems, we now have system architecture, bits versus atoms. So we have more flexibility. We don't have temporal constraints. We could have conversations going on over the course of a week, over a semester. They're not bounded by our 1 or 2 or 3 hours together with each other. We can have asynchronous communication. Though still in VLEs, they're often semester bound. We often carry over those hangovers. They don't have to be, but they often still are. And then all this wonderful communication happens with the VLE, and oops, it's all gone, and the student goes, and there's no persistence. Whereas what's on the web is persistent. But we can make choices again around how we manage VLEs, but often it's not done like that. And in open online spaces, again, there are risks as well as possibilities, but they can be usually more multimodal. There are different kinds of things that can be shared there because you can drag and pull things in from all the other spaces that you might be acting in. We have the potential to build trust and relationships, although they're messy and challenging. So we can have a conversation in our group, but other people can be joining it from outside who might be interested, who might be tuning into the hashtag, much like this may be happening, in this session and in many other sessions at the conference today. So in bounded online spaces, we're connected. In bounded online spaces, physical online spaces, we're connected, but we can't simultaneously share what we're doing in our community out with the wider world. And nor is it very easy to share things and voices and artifacts from outside in. Because quite often it's channeled through the privileges that the lecturer has to put things into the VLE, for example. So again, it's that message that what we do here is separate from outside. It's separate from all else we do. Formal learning is divorced from rather than integrated with informal learning practices. I think that's the message in terms of often in physical spaces and bounded online spaces. Whereas open online spaces, even in limited use, can enable networked and connected learning. So even if it's a classic module, as I've often taught myself, which might have some online presence in terms of VLE, and we do a couple of Twitter chats over the course of the semester, that throwing open the door, just in that very small way, purposeful, designed way, enables that sharing from outside in, from inside out, other voices and distributed discussions between students, one lecturer, many lecturers, other interested people, people from different education sectors, and so on. So it doesn't have, so I invite you not to think that, well, I'm not teaching a MOOC, so this isn't really relevant to me. It's not really about that. It's just about thinking about our practices and how we might use these different spaces. And identity is really important in this as well, and this is something that Catherine and I have talked a lot about. Because of course, we want to think about what learning spaces do we create with my students, but who are we in those spaces? So we have our embodied identities in a physical space like this. In a bounded online space, we have our real names. In my university, student or a lecturer, anybody can only have a name for their account that's the name from their birth certificate. If you want to be called something else, you have to go through all these hoops. So it's very, very rigid. And in open online spaces, you can be called anything. So the first time you run a Twitter chat or have some kind of interaction with students in open online spaces, realize that they have absolutely anything for their avatar, their Twitter names. I say it's messy, it's chaotic, whatever, but there are other things that can happen there. So I think that often is a barrier for people, if they haven't practiced learning in those spaces themselves. But learning, of course, is an identity transformation project. As we know, it's learning to be as well as learning to do. So embracing those complexities around identity in different spaces, I think, is really important. And without going into too much detail, I'm particularly looking at open online spaces as being a metaphorical third space. So not third in terms of physical, bounded, and open, but third space in terms of formal and informal. So I'm inspired a lot by Chris Gutierrez's work, where she did work in the language learning classroom. Some of you might be familiar, where other teachers weren't allowing students who were learning English as a second language to bring in the slang and the metaphors and the stories. They had to come in and speak formally in the language learning classroom. And Chris Gutierrez allowed all that in. She allowed all those kind of informal communication patterns and so on, and found that it enriched the learning process. So she created these third spaces, which combined formal and informal. So we can allow students to build on these kind of playful, collaborative practices of participatory popular culture and give students some more control over the nature and direction of learning. So I found certainly in my own practice that students often come in with a very confident online social identity from their experience in other networks. And a few years ago, I was really surprised at knowing that they interacted a lot in other spaces like Facebook and so on, and then inviting them to comment on one another's work or contribute to a discussion in some kind of university. So nothing happened, it was silent. I thought, well, no, they can do that, But again, it's this notion of identity. A lot of times what stops people is not, who am I sharing with, but who am I sharing as. So they have a confident online social identity, but not a confident online identity as a scholar, as a researcher, as a soon-to-be professional, or even as a citizen. Maybe very bounded into the domains of the social. So by using open online spaces, we can help our students to develop those voices and let them be messy and not perfect and so on, so they can develop strength around those identities and those voices. And really, if we're not doing that, we're letting students down, I feel. And so while we might think about the learning spaces that we create as the learning space, you know, the website or the VLE, whatever, I find it useful to just think about a learning space, like any particular learning space that we use in the course of any course that I am involved in, is just a learning space. So even if you do use the VLE, you know that students are active, you know, maybe in their Facebook group and on Twitter and lots of other spaces. So the space that we interact with students is just a learning space, not the learning space. And you know, I think that shift sometimes really helps. So how do we do this? How do we do all this? So it's wonderful. And I heard some great examples today. So my intention now is just to share a couple of examples of my own, and then just give some final ideas around openness and network learning, and then hopefully we can discuss this some more. So just from my own classroom a couple of years ago, you know, one of the best things I ever did was start the module. It was a module in professional skills for IT students, where they learned research skills and communication skills and so on. Was every year I would just ask them, what tools do you use? What do you use them for? What are they good for? What do you like about them? What do you don't? Because I'd say, we're going to use something for open online communication, but obviously I don't want to pick it. Let's join the site. So every year I would learn something new. There's some new tool or how students were using it. You know, 5 years ago when I first started teaching with Twitter, hardly any students were using Twitter, and now I'm sure they all are. Or most of them are. I still have not taught a class where every student was on Facebook. I don't know what people say about using Facebook. I always ask, and there's usually one or two people who aren't on Facebook, and likewise a few who aren't on Twitter. Another question that I like asking students instead of giving the parameters of the digital media project for the final assignment is ask what they'd like to create. So, you know, it's required by the course that the students develop these particular skills, but some of them might have a real interest in video or building a WordPress blog that they've never done before, or audio podcasting, or some passion. So I asked the students, what would you like to create to demonstrate, you know, that you can use these skills? And as came up in the session I was in before lunch, sometimes it's a really difficult question. So the students write down things and then they cluster them together. This is an example of students putting them on the wall in clusters. A whole bunch of people wanted to learn how to build a blog. Someone wanted to make tutorials. And says, I have no idea. So I spoke with that student and said, well, you know, what do you like? You know, what do you think about? And he says, well, what would you like me to do? And this is what we've done. You know, it's not that student's fault. It's what we've done in all the years leading up to this in school, which is, you know, tell you what to do it this way, and you'll get your grade, and so on. So when you're trying to break that, it isn't as easy as asking students, what would you like to create? Sometimes it's an ongoing discussion that can be difficult for some students. And you know, over the course of time, students learn about Creative Commons licensing and using open resources, education resources, creating open education resources, sharing them. This is an example of student presentations that we created, that we put together in a collection on Scoop It. We were able to share that artifact with other students. And I was active in a network called iColab for a number of years, which it's waning now, but other networks are taking its place. And it's just a bunch of educators who got together who were using these open practices, who said, you know, well, you know, my students can connect with your students, unmediated by us, if they're sharing things openly and they're on the web. So, you know, my students' presentations were shared with another group, and then they used those to kind of mash them up and get ideas to create their own. And this was a collection of educators across Europe and in New Zealand and Australia. We were talking about Tom Cochrane yesterday. And so, you know, it doesn't matter where we are. And our term times were all different. Obviously, the times of day that we would work, so we would have Google Hangouts. You know, some of us would be 10 p.m. at night, and others would be in the morning. I was just starting my term, other people were finishing their term. But it was described beautifully by Helen Keegan, who was one of the really active people in the network, as this idea of breaking outside the barriers using this tag team model. Now, this is a really long quote, but I think it's good, so I'll just leave it there for a second. About what's possible. So I've had this experience of students that I've taught, you know, 2 or 3 years ago, or whatever, that would send things to me or jump into a class conversation. It doesn't happen a lot, but because it's open, it's possible and it can happen. And that's just an example of using Martin Hoxie's Tags Explorer to kind of take a snapshot of conversation on a particular hashtag. This was the iColab hashtag. Now, people often ask, well, does every student really do this? You know, are they all kind of tweeting what they're doing? And, you know, well, the answer, of course, is no. I don't require students to use Twitter, but what I have learned is that modeling these practices, modeling openness and network learning, some students enthusiastically join in, but all of the students learn by what they're seeing. So as a community, we're on the web. So we're this node in the network as a community, the hashtag of our course. It doesn't mean that every single student has to be interacting in that way, but from students physically being part of that community that's interacting, it can be a powerful learning experience. And later on, some of them do become more active. So, you know, some feedback from students is, you know, some of them take a while and then realize that they can use some of those open practices for learning, which is quite a powerful, quite a powerful realization. The authors of the papers, you know, I would tag the authors if we're discussing a paper, and sometimes the authors join the conversation on Twitter and so on. And this idea of the formal and the informal. So the fact that you can actually use the networks that you use for socializing also for education, and you can kind of combine them a bit. So just a few final thoughts then just about each of these areas, digital literacies, openness, and connecting. There are a lot of tensions and dilemmas around digital practices, of course. You know, there's this tsunami of information on the web, there's the notion of curating, there's the notion of risk and surveillance and notions of privacy, but equipping students with digital literacies to kind of discuss these issues and make decisions about them is important for us to do in educational settings. Because students are making those decisions. They're making those decisions every day about what social networks to use and how much to share and what their privacy settings should be and who owns my data and, oh, I don't really want to think about it. And, you know, so let's foreground those discussions and have them together. And again, help students kind of address those dilemmas because they're ongoing. There are no answers about these things. They're evolving all the time. As an example of digital literacies, this is just, I invite you to look at this just as an artifact. Brian Mathers, I spoke at ALT in September, and Brian Mathers did a few visual notes during the talk, and this was one of them. I'm talking about this dissonance between the formal and the informal. So, you know, he made that visual available using a Creative Commons license. I was able to use this in this presentation because it has a Creative Commons license. We referenced the people who made that quote about the learning black market, which are Dave White and Don Lonco. And this whole idea that it's all in the open means that we can all share it, use it in different ways, build on it, use it for different purpose. That's kind of the essence of openness. So I think modeling these practices for students. So I don't create all the PowerPoint images or presentations that I would use in class. I would mix and match things from other people. I would model doing that, and then we talk about it. And just yesterday, Helen Beetham published a new model. Some of you might have been familiar with the Digital Literacies Framework. There's a new framework called the Digital Capabilities Framework. And Helen's web page is there where she talks about this because digital literacies are even evolving over time. So it includes this notion of paying attention to our digital identity and our digital well-being, communication, collaboration, and so on. And talking about these issues with students is critical. So before we ask students to be on Twitter, perhaps have a conversation and ask them to think about who they want to be on Twitter. Do they want to use their existing account? Or maybe create a new account to mess around and learn. You know, that's an example of digital literacies and reflecting on digital identity. Privacy, surveillance, all of these issues around data ownership and so on are all under this umbrella of digital literacies and digital capabilities. And you know, my suggestion is that we talk about those with students. And the notion of embedding them means that it's not something that students do separately. They don't go off and do digital literacies training because it's embedded in the context that we're in. So it's a different conversation if you're a history researcher than if you're an IT programmer. You know, we can have different conversations. It means different things. And one of the outstanding examples, I think, of digital literacies and owning one's own identity on the web is the domain of one's own, which was from work by Jim Broom and others at the University of Mary Washington, where students, instead of working in a VLE, are actually creating their own web space when they come into higher education, and then using that for their reflection, reflective work, and creative work throughout the course of their degree, and then they leave with that. It's an e-portfolio, and it's also their online presence. Second was choosing openness where possible and appropriate. And, you know, my suggestion is that we talk about those with students. And just yesterday, Helen Beetham published a new model. Some of you might have been familiar with the Digital Literacies Framework. There's a new framework called the Digital Capabilities Framework. And Helen Beetham these practices often sit uneasily within higher education. Bonnie Stewart has a great quote about, what that open kind of comes up against a lot of the traditional practices that we have in higher education. I just want to propose two frameworks that I have found useful when we're talking about openness, when we have conversations about openness. And one is being clear about what definition people are using when they say open, because it means different things to different people. So 4 main definitions of openness are open admission, that's what open means in terms of the Open University. Free, so Khan Academy and YouTube and all those things that are freely available on the web, they're called open. Openly licensed or open educational resources are open, they're free, but they're also licensed because the person who creates them and shares them says, I'm making this available and you can use it under these terms. So like that Brian Maller's image that I shared. And then there's open educational practices, which is this whole notion of getting students to share outside traditional spaces. So they kind of build one upon the other, and there's a bit of a divide between free and OER. There's a lot of people demand that we should be openly licensing the work, because if something's available for free, but I can't use it in the way that I want to use it in the space I want to use it, well then it's not much use to me. So that's, if you're speaking about openness with someone, it's useful to figure out what definition of open they're using. And the second is what level of openness. So we can talk about open activities, a random Twitter chat, open practices, which become kind of how you operate. If you do a slideshare presentation, you share it. If you're thinking about your work, you blog, and so on. And then the higher level than that is open values, valuing yourself as an open practitioner, and then creating a culture of openness. So to what extent do any of our institutions are we building towards a culture of openness? And the motivation is very different. Some people are motivated to make courses open, for example, because they want to enhance the brand of the university, and they're very clear about that. Others want to improve access to education for people who can't afford it, or who are in parts of the world where they can't access education. Others are motivated because they want to enable co-production of knowledge and see openness as a way to do that. And the fourth, area again is just people who really want to foster more equity in education, more equitable conversations, kind of level conversations between students and teachers. So what are the definitions people are using? What are their assumptions and what are their motivations? And if you have a conversation with openness with anybody and you can kind of dig down to these questions, then you'll have a productive conversation. It's a good place to start. And finally, just in terms of openness, I just think, if any of you have seen Gardner Campbell's keynote from, I think it was the Open Education Conference 2012, called Ecologies of Yearning, he crystallizes a lot of what I think is very important, which is that openness isn't really an adjective, it's a verb. It's opening, it's a process. And I think that's very powerful. So it's kind of what we learn, how we learn, who with, and why. So it isn't about the thing, per se, the artifact. It's about the process. Some examples, I've just included some examples, and at the end of the presentation I have some people to follow on Twitter if you're not, a lot of people that I've mentioned in this conversation. So these are 5 projects that won awards in the Open Learning Challenge 2013 that are all just compelling examples. Digilet Leicester, Joseph Fraser, V&R, DS106. These are great places if you're saying, well, what can I do in my context? Dig into these. These are fantastic resources that you can learn from, and they're all open and shared, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. And finally, that third one about connecting is learning is social and connected. We all know that. So helping students to find and develop their voices and their identities is really important, and we can model these if we use open practices and use open spaces purposefully. And as educators, we can be part of students' decisions about who they are on the web, the identities, the practices, and the networks that they develop, and we can learn a lot from them as well. So, and conclude with this quote from Carrie Facer and Neil Selwyn, because this puts the onus back on us as educators and as institutions. Our learners need to practice and experiment with these ways of enacting their identities and ways of learning, but these opportunities can only be supported by academic staff who are themselves engaged in digital practice. And studies have shown that student engagement increases when academic staff embody and model digital literacies. So, we do have a really critical role to play there. And actually, I lied when I said that was the last quote, because I'm just going to show one more quote, which is by Freire, one of my favorites. Dialogue cannot exist in the absence of profound love for the world and its people. In the last 6 days, 2 beautiful educators in Ireland, very powerful educators, died very unexpectedly. Bianca Grogan and Mary Monaghan, both of them were friends of mine. And I just wanted to include their presence here today because they touched me and my practice and who I am as an educator and also me as a person. And I just wanted to share them here today and have them be present. So thank you very much.